Hello and welcome to Tonebenders. I am your host for today, Tim Muirhead, and sitting with me is Teresa Morrow as my co-host today. Teresa, how you doing?
I'm good, Tim.
Excellent. Thanks for joining me. We are super lucky because our guests today are two of the sound leads on Damien Chazelle's recent film, First Man. First up, we have Ai-Ling Lee, who is one of the re-recording mixers, sound designer, and co-supervising sound editor. Her previous credits include La La Land, Deadpool, Maze Runner, Wild, and Tangled. Welcome to the show, Ai-Ling.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
No problem. Also joining us is Mildred Iatrou Morgan, co-supervising sound editor on First Man. You can hear her previous work in films like La La Land, for which both of you were nominated for an Oscar, Battle of the Sexes, and Hairspray. Welcome, Millie.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
This is really awesome that you guys were able to take the time to talk to us because I love the film First Man. I wasn't expecting not to love it, but it bowled me over.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're really happy that you guys really like the movie. So.
Well, you must be really happy with your work on it too, because it's a real stunner of a film, and the soundtrack has to carry a lot of the film. In fact, the very first scene of the film, there's not really any music. Maybe there's some drones. That's something we can talk about, where the music and sound effects separate. But the first scene of the film is Neil Armstrong doing a test flight, and he goes up into space and bounces off the atmosphere. There's no dialogue, essentially no music. I guess there's some dialogue in the comms, but no, Neil Armstrong doesn't say anything. It's all on you to make this work. What was going through your head when you first saw that scene?
The first scene, the X-15 sequence, it sets the tone for the film. Basically, it starts the movie and throws you right into the seat of the cockpit. It's intense, claustrophobic, and it feels like you are seeing it from the perspective of Neil. Meanwhile, because it's a X-15 is a rocket-powered aircraft, and it's not like a typical aircraft that it can just fly back down. So Damien and Tom realize they need sound to also help explain to the viewers what's happening. We were working closely with the picture editorial, especially at the moment once Neil is up in space and he sees the curvature of Earth's atmosphere, and he realized he's drifting upwards, and he had to cut back down into the atmosphere at a certain angle in order to glide back to Earth. A lot of that information is hard to understand for a regular layperson. And so they had to trim down all the technical jargon and try to simplify all the communications between mission control to Neil. So with that, with the dialogue ADR crew, they had a lot of specific radio communications to Neil. And for Neil, we had a lot of Ryan Gosling's breathings and efforts that could also help tell us how he was feeling at the moment. And also with the use of, a radio static, because the clearer you hear the radio communications, the closer he is to Earth. And then when you start hearing the static and the radio voices goes away, he's leaving further away from Earth. And so we kind of use that logic to try to explain to the audience what's happening. And also that section there for the sound effects is pretty quiet, except for some low drone or metal creaks. It's just mainly the ticking of the altimeter that kind of helps show the audience he's gaining in height.
So the way that the scene plays out, you're using the sound of metal shaking to kind of illustrate the claustrophobicness of this jet. Where did you get all these metal sounds from?
Yeah, very early on, and when we were in touch with Damien about this movie, and having seen the animatics that he created during pre-production, we kind of had an idea we will need a lot of very intense turbulent shakes. And we tried to record different methods of shaking metal pieces or vehicles without making it sound synthetic. So we went out to record motion simulator vehicle, especially when the machine, when it injects low frequencies to the entire motion simulator vehicle ride to heavily shake and vibrate the entire vehicle. It gives us a very natural sounding shake that also sounds like it's from a very tight, confined space, rather than finding a piece of metal and just shaking it by hand. And there's these things that's called the I-beam. It's basically like a low frequency vibrator that people use for like their cars, boombox, or like a home theater to connect under their theater seats for the extra shake and rumble. So those are attached to different size vehicles and metal panels to naturally vibrate and shake to get the resonance of the metals. And plus our Foley team, who are the Foley walkers, Dan O'Connell and John Cucci, they did brilliant work at creating all that creaks and groans of the cockpit scenes.
So were you doing a lot of advanced research, trying to piece together on some level what it actually sounded like inside the vehicles and looking for realistic or vintage sound effects that would be accurate?
So early on, after reading the script and seeing some of the animatics that Damien provided to us, besides the fact that the script is based on this very detailed biography of Neil Armstrong, having read those books and watched many different documentaries regarding the early years of the American space race, I was curious to understand the technology that first took us to this other world, to figure out how it sounded and felt inside the rockets and the space capsules. But a big part of it is also about reading up about interviews with all these former astronauts on how they would describe what it feels like when they are inside the rocket during the launch, or how it sounded when they are suited up in the spacesuits. So I wrote a bunch of questions to a former astronaut. His name is Jim Lovell, who participated in the Gemini and the Apollo program. He very kindly handwrote back to me. And what stood out to me was his description of the constant roar during like the Apollo launch and how little outside sounds, could be heard from inside their spacesuits. It's almost like once they suited up, they mostly hear their own breathing and helmet air from the life support system. But, you could also read from like various books how Neil and Buzz and Mike Collins, how they described the difference between the Gemini launch and, say, the Apollo launch. Damien is also, aware and attuned how with sound design, sound effects, that it helps make it a much more visceral feeling, which was great for us. And he wants things to sound as authentic as possible. So we ended up, we went and, record different kinds of rocket launches, especially for the 7.5 launch. We recorded SpaceX when they launched the Falcon Heavy, which was, last year now, at Cape Canaveral, I think on the same launch pad where they had launched the 7.5. We were able to have close-up access to place microphones on the launch pad just so we could try to get as much authentic ignition of the close-up crackle of the rocket launch and quarter-mile distance and 3-mile distance recordings, even the sonic booms when it re-enters the atmospheres. We repurposed it for the X-15 sequence when he breaks through the atmosphere. And to help add to the weight and feeling of these rocket launches, we record JPL, which is NASA's JPL's acoustic chamber, so that we could help the audience feel the low end rumbling during the launch. Basically, like they blast the chamber with nitrogen gas to create this sound. And it's used to test components by simulating the acoustics inside a rocket during the launch. So,
Wow.
So we recorded all that intense low-end sound with many different mics. One of the recorders and the engineers at Universal, they converted a JBL subwoofer speaker cone into a mic input, so we could record through that and the various multitude of other mics that we could set up there. And then for the smaller sounds, because Damien wanted to feel a closeness and a sense of tactile feeling of how close you are to the astronauts. and how confined the space is when you're inside the capsule with them. So, you'll hear every little glove creak or the helmet clicks. Frank Montano, being this big space geek that he is, he had a lot of connections and was able to record a bunch of actual artifacts, astronaut suit from, the Apollo mission, and the X-15 suit of the helmet clicks and the umbilical cord snaps, glove creaks, even the helmet air hiss from the life support system that you hear in the movie. It sounds like that. Oh yeah, and also like mission control blocks, all them buttons and switches, just the little tiny detail stuff that we could get as authentic as we can.
Yeah, it's really cool how those sounds make a difference. I loved that all the switches and stuff, you didn't feel the need to put beeps in. So many GD science fiction films, whenever someone flips a switch, you hear the click and a little beep. And it was nice to just hear the mechanicalness of it. It made it feel like it was just a metal box that they're floating through space in.
Yeah.
So you guys are both credited as co-sound supervisors on it.
Correct.
How did you go about dividing up the workload?
This is, I think, the 6th or 7th movie I've worked with Ai-Ling, and what we do is she's the sound designer and supervises all the sound effects and Foley. I mean, there's a Foley supervisor, but she works with a Foley supervisor, and I'm in charge of all the spoken words, the dialogue, the ADR, the loop group. And we work together and, on our sides, and then we're constantly playing things for each other and getting notes from each other and keeping each other up to date as to what we're working on. So in terms of First Man, one of my biggest challenges was dealing with the comms, because most of the comms, I would say about 60 to 75% of them were actual comms from NASA that were actually used in these space missions. But I then had to add comms that we were recreating for story purposes. In order to make certain story beats clearer, I had to bring in the actors or bring in loop group people to create these comms, but then they had to all sound and blend together seamlessly.
How did that come through the process?
It started from even pre-production. Ai-Ling referenced those, the animatics, and which were so useful in so many ways. And in those animatics, they actually had the comms that they were going to use in the sequence. They were mostly archival comms. And then as they edited the film, as it was shot and then they edited it, they carried those comms forward. But then as they got more into the editing, we were back and forth. We were constantly getting, the cuts of the film so that we could do our sound work on them. And every time I got a new version, there would be new lines of dialogue added. And there would usually be people from the cutting room. And they would throw like a very simple futz on it. And then it would be my job to figure out, okay, I'm going to do this with an actor from the film, or this one I'm going to get a loop group person. And then I cast for a loop group. We worked with Ranjani Brau-Prieto, and actually I sent her some comms, some archival comms, and I said, please try to find me voices that would sound like they come from the same period. So she sent me a whole bunch of auditions, and then I went through them and picked out the ones that sounded the most authentic or sounded as though they could have come from that period. And then I would have to record those on an ADR stage. And then sometimes while they were editing, I would put a futz on it, but then at the very end, during the final mix, John Taylor, who was our dialogue mixer, created a futz palette for all the comms that was then used throughout the final mix.
I'm really interested to hear more about the futz aspect of it, because it's so well done and it imparts a lot of character to the different individuals in the film. But I also want to mention the voice casting, because I don't know, that's one of my pet peeves is period films where like people used to talk differently, and it's such a elusive art to find actors and to voice direct people into that space.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and that bugs me too when I feel like somebody just jumps out of a movie, especially if it's the voice. I find it extremely irritating. Damien is incredibly precise in what he wants and very, very picky, as he should be, as all great directors should be. So my goal was to come up with voices that Damien wouldn't then say, get rid of that guy. He does not fit in at all. So I was very, very diligent in terms of casting, and Rajani Prieto and Ashley Lambert were very good. They gave me lots of very good people. But one instance in particular, when we first start the sequence at NASA, we have all the astronauts are watching a NASA film about what their mission is going to be. In that case, that is an actual NASA film. And there was an actual NASA recording that went with it of a narrator, but we couldn't use it due to copyright reasons. So I could use the text, but I had to re-record the voice. And what they gave me was the picture editor just saying those words. So I went and I found this guy, and I just thought he sounded perfect, and he did a great performance. And then I brought it into the dialogue pre-dub, and John Taylor put this amazing futz on it where he also did like a time speed variation, so it sounded a little warped. And when we first played it for Damien, he said for a second he thought it was the actual NASA track that we were going to replace. He got really confused, and he turned to me and he was like, I can't believe you fooled me. So I felt really happy at that moment that Damien bought it. He thought it was an actual NASA film recording. He has an amazing ear. He really does.
So, Millie, the main character in this film, Neil Armstrong, he barely speaks throughout the whole film. I was saying to someone, it was you, Teresa, that the Kyle Chandler character is like the 9th most important character in the film, maybe, and he has like 5 times as many lines as the main character in the film. So much of his performance is told through breaths and grunts and such. Was that all done in ADR, or was that done on set? And how did you tackle all that?
It was a combination. For example, that X-15 sequence, the opening sequence in the film, originally when they were cutting it, Damien recorded a temp track of all the breaths and grunts and all that stuff. And it was, again, meticulously cut to picture. And then Damien said to me, okay, now do this with Ryan Gosling, and I want it to be exactly the same. So that was another challenge. So he was great. Ryan Gosling is very good at ADR, and he's very focused. And so we had to do it several times, and then it was my job to cut it together so that it sounded just like what Damien did, because everything was so choreographed, and he hit certain points a certain way, and certain grunts were in a certain cadence and all this stuff. So, but all in all, throughout the film, it was a combo of stuff recorded on set and ADR breaths. And I have to say, in terms of ADR, there was almost no ADR recorded to replace dialogue, which is pretty amazing, considering they shot a lot of these scenes in these very, very noisy locations. But Mary Ellis did a great job. She mic'd everybody. For example, in Mission Control, 20, 30 actors were all mic'd. Everybody in that room was mic'd. So I was able to use almost everything that was recorded on set.
Wow, that must have been a hell of a dialogue edit when you pulled up all those tracks.
Yes, Susan Dawes was the dialogue supervisor, and she did her pass on that scene, and she pulled out all the lavs, and it sounded absolutely beautiful. She did an amazing job. And then when we put it up at the mix, Damien said, that sounds too clean. So we had to go, and because I had been cutting with the mix track, and he liked that in the mix track, there were more of the paper sounds, more of the room sounds, more grit and more noise. And so Susan and I had to figure out, okay, let's use the mix track here. Okay, let's go to the lav here. So it ended up being a combo.
It's a really interesting approach to dialogue in this film, and it's not crystal clear dialogue all the way through, which over the past years there have been conversations about this, like how people go overboard in underplaying dialogue and it ends up taking people out when they're watching the film. I found in this film is such an interesting approach because the dialogue kind of weaves up and down with everything else that's going on. Obviously, like crazy, chaotic scenes where effects are rightfully overpowering dialogue. Not even necessarily in the space scenes, in some of the home life scenes as well. Mm-hmm. Usually you're like, oh, what's going on? This is really bugging me as a viewer. But right. I never had that experience in that film. And it's a real stylistic thing that I feel like you really pulled off
Yeah, like a home, like almost like a home video kind of feel.
Yeah, you just roll with it. Yeah.
Yeah, and for example, one of the scene during the mix, I think it was after Neil learned about that he got assigned to be, on the Gemini 8, and then his family and his neighbor's wife, they were all gathered at his backyard on the pool, listening to Oklahoma, and the kids are playing, the wives were chatting, and Neil's like cleaning the pool. All those different layers of dialogue. I remembered that JT, had originally and us with all the spotted effects and Foley, to make sure we clear all the different layers of dialogue over each other, all the screaming kids and Janet's dialogue. We want to make sure we could hear everything. And then Damien would hear it and he would go, no, it should kind of play like they're just talking, chit-chatting, and the kids are having fun and yell and shout, kind of poke through and overstep on her dialogue sometimes. It's fine. It should be almost like this interwoven mess of a layering of a dialogue. And so we're, oh, really? And then we're like, oh, okay. It turned out it worked really well. And, a lot of it is through Damien's vision and his leadership, but of course we try to craft it as best as we can. But like you said, during those loud cockpit sequences, there may be like certain technical terms, that even if we play on its own, us as a layperson, we have no idea what it means.
Yeah.
It could be like CPS, ignition lock, or whatever, and then we go, no idea what it is. And so in that case, it's okay if some of the sound effects takes over the dialogue a little.
It's such a fine line with that stuff. It shows a level of finesse in the mixing.
Yeah, thank you.
You're listed as one of the re-recording mixers. What were you mixing? What area were you tackling?
So I mixed mostly the effects and the design. We all mixed on S6s. Mm-hmm. So basically on the mix stage, we had 3 S6. So one of the S6 would be dialogue ADR music, and then effects and design. And then the third is Foley and backgrounds. And so I mixed the effects and design.
The movie setting obviously provides a really perfect location for using Atmos in really cool ways. Do you want to talk a bit about what kind of fun things you got to try out? And maybe I'm kind of curious as to how people are evolving their attitudes towards mixing in Atmos as time goes on and as you mix more films with that.
Well, quite a lot of the movies I've mixed nowadays, they are mostly the native Atmos mix, including First Man. And Damien's also big into it too, because we did that on La La Land too. So for this, it's really beneficial because, in a sense, even though First Man is mostly a very quiet and impersonal film, it has these big launch sequences, which having Atmos really helps a lot. So the other quiet family personal scenes, in the mix is more like narrower, more upfront. But in these big mission sequences, we wanted to surround our audience in it. It's not about being loud. For me, one of the biggest beneficial Atmos is the full range surrounds.
Yes.
So it can carry that weight and the size of the sounds. So it worked great for all these rocket launch scenes in this movie. And also, of course, with some of the overheads for the objects panning in this scenario for this movie, you have the multi-axis trainer sequence. And
that is a cool scene.
Oh, cool, very good. It's sometimes about just not to be too gimmicky about it, because it's mostly about picking out like 1 or 2 elements, say, in the Gemini spin sequence to put into the objects and pan them around from one side wall to the next side wall or overhead front to back. It depends on the moves, on the sound too. how it reacts in the theater, on the mix stage. Sometimes it takes some trial and error. You may go, hey, I can try this sound, let me pan it, and then you may pan it and go, not sure, I kind of like the image before that it had better. Then we will revert back. Sometimes less is more, in a sense, that when you do end up using it for panning around, it has more effect. But yeah, for me, Atmos is the full range surrounds, and I would imagine for the music, it's also able to pull some of that music a little bit away from the screen a little bit, just to clear some kind of room for the dialogue, being that this movie is such an intimate film.
There's so much to unpack with this film. I want to ask like 9 questions at once here. Something that I want to talk about is your use of silence in this film. It's not something that narratively a lot of films are able to do. There's some unique moments in this film where silence is called for. And going to silence is, that's the easy part. It's getting out of silence that is hard. How did you guys design the soundtrack to be able to get back out?
A lot of the silences in this movie, a lot of it is very quiet, mainly because, Damien wanted the sound to convey like space, to have this lonely, chilling feeling. And sometimes when we play quiet, we have some kind of low drone or something kind of sound, even though people may say it's silent or quiet. Mm-hmm. But the thing is, there's moments in this film, sometimes even long sections in it, where there's absolutely zero sound in there. Say, for example, when we are on the moon, after they opened the lunar lander's hatch door, the big contrast in sound from the air suction sound from the hatch door to the complete sonic silence on the moon's surface. We remained in that pure sonic silence for a really long time. And so we had to gradually mix in and blend in the helmet air hiss and Neil's breathing to get us out of that silence, just so that way we can introduce the audience back inside Neil's head and also try to recreate as best as we can from how the astronauts described how it sounds inside the spacesuit. It's some kind of finesse mixing in a sense, because you wanted to slowly fade the sound up, because I have different layers of air hiss in there. I had to be really gentle and easy on introducing some of the air hiss first. Then JT introduced some of Neil's breathing that Millie had done. So a lot of it is about maybe, depending on the frequency of the sounds. If it's like a higher frequency, maybe, I can slowly, gradually mix up the volume, or tapering some of the lower frequency away, or slowly introducing it back as it slowly comes in. But yeah, to have enough time to get back to full sound level, it helps.
It worked really, really well. And there was another moment of silence that I wanted to ask what you were thinking about with it. In the opening scene, right before the plane lands, there's like maybe a half second we go to silence, and then you have the crash. Did you discover that at the mix, or was that designed into it from the beginning?
It was designed into it from the beginning. It's kind of something about like what we do as sound editors sometimes. And also it helps when it gets to the mix. This helps us create some form of tension and helps with the dynamics. So that, when you have nothing, you have a lot more to go with the loudness after that. You don't have to go too loud to still get that impact. It's also partially also Damien's really into using sound, so he wanted usage of these in the film. So this was a good area for it. And it worked really well because everything amps up right to that one moment, and then a split second later, it hits and impacts.
It works. I've tried to do that technique a couple times on shows that I've been working on.
Yeah.
And you have to have the right director that's willing to take that risk, because it is a little out of the ordinary. But I think it works so well that it's worth the risk.
It is. Sometimes we do that, but to varying lengths of silence. This one is a little bit longer beat. But yeah, it's up to the filmmaker a lot of the times. We try to do the best as we can, but yeah, in the end, it's up to the filmmaker.
Did you want to talk about the helmet treatments?
Millie, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll
Talk a bit
start.
about how that was done?
Yeah, so like I said earlier, what we're hearing in the film, it's almost all production dialogue. So what you're hearing when they're in the spacecraft with their helmets on, we're hearing the production sound. But then we had to go and record some additional lines of ADR. And it was really great that Frank Montano, who makes the backgrounds of the Foley, is also a space fan, and he knows all about all these missions. And he, with a friend of his, built a helmet box that we used to worldize the ADR, so that when I had a line of ADR, I didn't have to worry about how to record it. I just recorded it clean on the ADR stage. And then during pre-dubs and during the final, we were able to send the clean ADR out to a helmet box and then have it returned back to the mix. And then John Taylor could adjust it so that it, matched what was done in production.
One helmet is high altitude helmets, like for the X-15 Gemini mission, which is, I think, was based off like the Soviet, like a MiG helmet, either a Chinese or a Soviet MiG helmet. And then there's a second helmet in this helmet box that is more like a bubble helmet that is for the Apollo mission. They are not like real authentic ones because, Smithsonian landed to us. So then, they had the engineer at Universal built this pretty big soundproof box, and they ran the cable all the way from, where the machine room is to this box. And so it has a little car radio speaker to play the sound, and then a little lavalier mics in each of these helmets, and with different padding and all that, just to control the reflections. And so that way JT can, whenever he wants to, send some of these through his aux sands, almost acting like a effects box.
When people describe this sort of stuff, those always seem like the most fun asides in the creation of a soundtrack. But I don't know, like maybe different mixers have different ideas of like whether or not it's worth the effort to do this kind of stuff.
Totally. I mean, personally, I've also researched with other mixers who worked on like The Martian and all that, which sounded great, personally, I feel. And different people are on different shows, and we try different things, like on Deadpool, we try different things. Whenever a character's in the mask or in a helmet, what do you do when you have ADR? And then you sometimes try impulse responsing, like the prop helmet, try to use impulse response on it, or EQing it, or in this case, actually worldizing it. To varying degree, they have different effect, but it seems to be sometimes the most effective so far, my experience goes.
It has the benefit of being able to say, this is what it really sounds like.
Yeah. Yeah. And in this case, also, with Frankie, because he's such a big space fan, he collects some stuff too, so it's fun for him to do this.
Tim and I were talking about this. There's one scene when the Gemini capsule goes out of control and is spinning. And there's cutting from inside the capsule to outside the capsule. And there's very distinctive difference in the design. Obviously, outside the capsule, there's no sound. So the design is a little more stylistic. And we were talking about, like, how much time do you get to experiment? How many different things do you try when you have a moment like that that's so distinctive and specific and has to be really momentous?
Yeah, so for this Gemini, I guess we just kind of call it the Gemini spin sequence. We had to sell the idea that they are spinning out of control and the spin is increasing in speed over time and, could possibly kill them. When we cut outside of the cockpit into the space, we tried various different sounds. We tried to not use the same sounds when we are inside the cockpit, of course, so as to have feel a difference of it, but some of those elements we would still have to carry it over inside the cockpit, so it feels like it's one thing. But a lot of it we basically play around with sounds of like Dopplering or pitch bending, sounds like wind and air, and even rising tones, Dopplering them, and sometimes even like metal vibrating that we would pitch bend it so it feels like it's going in a rotation, and then we would just loop it. Let's see, or even like helicopter blade whoops, or Dopplering processing breaths too, and tremolating, rolling synth sound sometimes. One section, which is the second half of this Gemini spin sequence, and that spinning there, Damien wanted it to sound even more heightened and surreal. And that one we actually took a long time. We didn't actually settle on the sounds of that until midway through the final mix, which basically, we tried many different things. We tried train coupling sounds and some low pulse, low synth sounds that I created through Reactor and whatnot. And we also used some elements from Justin Hurwitz, the composer. He also made like a loop kind of sound with many different instruments, which we kind of selected the flute, strings, and a few radio squelches to make up these loops that then I processed through a distortion plugin like a Decapitator from Sound Toys. That then in the mix, when it's out in the space and the exterior cut, mixed everything more narrower and up front in the screen, so that when we cut back into the cockpit, it folds back around us. So as to get a sense of difference. But I think it's a combination of Justin's elements and some of the effects elements. I think it ended up working for us the best. So that took a while of trial and error.
This is one of my favorite questions that I get to ask sound supervisors. And this is kind of a perfect situation to ask it in because one of you was on the mixing board. Millie, when you're doing the sound supervision at the mix, are you the kind of supervisor that sits in the back and lets the mixers make choices? Or are you the kind of sound supervisor that's constantly telling them what should be going up and what should be going down?
I pretty much sit there and let them do their job. I feel like what we've presented and we've, during pre-dubbing, we shape it so that I feel like it'll play the way I presented it, but then if I feel like the mixer's going in a direction that I don't agree with, I'll always go up to him. Normally my technique is, instead of saying it in front of God and everybody, I just kind of walk over to the mixer and tell the mixer directly, if I think maybe put less futs on this or maybe ADR would be better here. But in general, I kind of let the mixer do their job.
And do you ever really mess with Ai-Ling?
Never. I never mess with Ai-Ling because Ai-Ling always knows what she's doing.
How did your partnership come about, Millie?
The very first film we worked together on was We Bought a Zoo. It was a Cameron Crowe film. Mm-hmm. And Ai-Ling was the sound designer and I was the sound supervisor, and I was working with another woman who decided she didn't want to co-supervise with me. And so Ai-Ling and I were working together and we worked really well. I can't remember exactly how it came about, but I think I said, Ai-Ling, do you want to co-supervise? And she's like, yeah. So that's how it started, and we've been doing it that way ever since. And it was great. We had a really good experience on that. And then I think the one that we did after that, I believe, was a film called Hitchcock, directed by Sacha Gervasi.
Do you think it's unusual for partnerships like this, or is this kind of a thing that develops and, there's pairs of people working all over?
Well, there apparently are pairs of people working, but two women working together, I guess it's a little unusual because when we were nominated for La La Land and it showed up in Variety that we were the first team of women to be nominated as co-sound supervisors, I was really surprised. I thought, surely someone else must have done this. And even now, I'm thinking, I don't know too many teams of women working together. I know there are a lot of teams of, one man, one woman, or two men, of course, there's lots of those, but not too many two women working together.
Is there anything about it, or is it just two individuals?
I think things are changing now, but I feel like, especially when I was starting out, which was like 30 years ago, there was this idea that sound effects and sound design was sort of a man's job and men did that. And so that when you had teams of co-supervisors, you often had a guy doing the sound design and then maybe a woman being the, like kind of what I do, like the dialogue ADR. And I've been aware of teams working in that way. But I think, unfortunately, Ai-Ling is still pretty unusual that she's a woman who does sound design, sound supervising, and sound effects mixing. I find that there are very few women that I can think of right now who are doing that. So Ai-Ling's still kind of a maverick.
Okay.
I don't know. I don't want to speak for you, Ai-Ling, but
No, thank you. Yeah, I think Millie is right. From my experience from being nominated for Oscars for La La Land, I was really surprised that we were the first female sound team to be nominated. And but I feel like there's more and more women, who are interested in like sound nowadays, be it in dialogue ADR or even sound design and mixing. I've been meeting a lot more women, young women who are interested in it nowadays. So I would hope the future will be changing soon.
I'm from an earlier generation, and I went to film school. I started working in post-production as a sound assistant and also a picture assistant, and I did a little bit of everything. And I didn't intend out of film school, I'm going to be a supervising sound editor. I just wanted a job, and it led me to sound editing and sound supervising, and I found I really loved it, and I'm really happy with what I'm doing. Ai-Ling is a different example. Ai-Ling started right away wanting to be a sound effects editor and sound designer, right, Ai-Ling?
Yeah, I'm from Singapore, and so just grew up because my dad, like, he had his own little home entertainment system at home, and he loved watching movies over and over again. He only owned a handful of Hollywood films, and so we watched like Terminator 2 like so many times. But what also took me into it was also like, say, Jurassic Park and stuff. But then having watched all these movies, it kind of made me feel like sound is such a powerful tool. It's invisible, but it still affected me and brought me into that film's environment, its world. And sometimes it even works when you don't see it. You just hear it and you get the feeling. But, in Singapore at that time, that was like mid-90s. Singapore at that time, they didn't have any film school. I just went to a different school for like audio engineering, more for like music rather than post-production. Then I found work there at a post house that does like radio, TV commercials and music recording and mixing. But because they don't normally do much films in Singapore at that time, so I just kind of like wrote letters to like sound department heads at studios here in Los Angeles and some other owners of different sound companies like Sound Deluxe and all that. Like, hey, I'm from Singapore, would you mind if I sit in and, learn a little bit about what you do and stuff. And some of them reply. And so I came out here in 1998 and got a job. So I guess generationally it's different. And especially nowadays, there's a lot more classes at schools now that are more focused on, say, sound and even some film making classes that hopefully would also emphasize more on sound too. Because it's a very useful tool in the storytelling process.
I feel like we're on a bit of an upswing in terms of recognition of that, hopefully.
Yeah.
Well, and you two are doing more than your part, because on this film, there's you two. The dialogue supervisor was a woman, I believe. And Nia Hansen, a friend of the podcast here, she was one of your editors. And was the location recordist a female as well?
Yes.
Well, a lot of that would be Damien as well, because there are women involved in all aspects of sound on this film. And Damien's always been really supportive. He's really into sound, and I'm just so happy after working with him on La La Land, he wanted to work with us again on First Man. So that was really exciting.
They seem to be a tight trio. him and Tom Cross and the composer.
Justin Hurwitz.
Justin Hurwitz, yeah.
Yeah, like it seems like they, between the three of them, have really locked down what they want. Like you're saying, the animatics were even so detailed. Is Justin involved right from the top in this film?
Yes, he was. I believe that even when Damien, they were working on the animatics, Justin has been like coming up with different themes and sending, different versions, so many versions of it to Damien, and there's a lot of back and forth. But I recall, I think Justin saying like sometimes they may play some of his score and his demo on set just for mood and stuff. With Damien and Justin, the music element starts really early, which is really beneficial to us.
What I think is to their credit, I really loved how there isn't music wall to wall. And in this genre, I don't know if you call this a genre of film, like this sort of heroic American history biopic. I feel like sometimes like those films really rely on music for drama. And the use of music in this film is actually really well balanced with the effects.
Yeah, I feel like that's one of the things I love about working on this film is that they left a lot of room for sound. I mean, two huge sequences, the X-15, which opens the film, and the Apollo 8 launch. In the X-15, there's very little music, almost no music. It's only in the middle of it when he's just floating up there. You hear a tiny bit of music, and then most of it's carried by the sound effects. And same thing with the Gemini 8 launch. It's all sound effects.
It's an amazing accomplishment to tell the story through sound effects the way you have.
Yeah, again, back to this animatics thing, I think a lot of the times when Damien just has like a very specific vision in his head, even before he shoots and throughout the whole production and post-production process. And for every single element, for all departments on the film, sound included. And so I think early on he had set it up where some of these set piece scenes, the X-15 or Gemini sequence or the LLTV sequence, there weren't really any music. And he actually also tried the Apollo launch first without music, and then he just thought that launch needs to sound different. It needs to sound more majestic and grander, and that's why during post-production he asked Justin to compose music for that. And Justin was, he's a very smart composer. He knows there's a lot of bombastic sounds involved in there, and so he picked different instrumentations in the orchestration that won't really conflict with the sound.
I think there's also a thing for me when I was watching it as a sound person myself, to see a film that sound takes such a lead role on while accomplishing all the goals, but also not sounding stereotypical. I didn't feel like it was Tom Hanks' Apollo 13 redo or anything like that. Like it was its own piece. It's actually a really quiet film for a big space epic. When we're not in a spaceship, it's really minimal in the soundtrack in many spots. But I just loved that you guys were given a really difficult challenge and you really stepped up to it. So congratulations on that.
Thank you so much, you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for being a part of the show today, and we're looking forward to whatever you're working on next.
Thank you both.
Great,
It's
thank
so
you.
much fun talking to you.
Thanks for listening to Tonebenders. You can find us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Stitcher. If you listen on iTunes or Stitcher, please write us a review while you're there. To support the show, go to tonebenderspodcast.com and click through our Amazon link or leave us a tip. You can also download and listen to our entire show archive there and leave a comment on our site or on SoundCloud. Keep up to date by following at the Tonebenders on Twitter or find Tonebenders Podcast on Facebook and YouTube. Email us with your questions and ideas at info@tonebenderspodcast.com.